Welcome to the Visual COBOL in a Nutshell series of presentations. This module will cover how ADO.NET can be used within a Visual COBOL managed .NET application to provide access to the data within a relational database using structured query language, or SQL. So what exactly is ADO.NET? Well, ADO stands for ActiveX Data Objects, and .NET refers to the Microsoft .NET framework. The name ActiveX Data Objects is actually a holdover from a previous technology called simply ADO, which provided a method of accessing relational databases through the instantiation of COM objects. ADO.NET is actually a set of classes that are an integral part of the .NET framework that provide access to relational XML databases and application data. ADO.NET consists of a well-defined set of classes that provide consistent access to data sources such as SQL Server, Oracle, and DB2. Managed .NET applications use these ADO.NET providers to connect to those data sources to retrieve and update data using standard SQL statements. ADO.NET also supports a disconnected processing model whereby your application can work directly with an in-memory copy of a relational database in the form of objects such as data sets and data tables. These objects can be passed from program to program and can be used for binding to GUI controls such as grids and lists. The DataSet Object is a memory-resident representation of a database. It represents a complete set of data, including related tables, constraints, and relationships among these tables. Datasets can be created and populated directly by calling methods in the DataSet objects, or they can be filled from the content of database tables on disk using other classes such as the Data Adapter class. Visual COBOL provides either direct access to these ADO.NET classes using object-oriented programming or a higher level interface to ADO.NET in the form of precompiler technology called OpenESQL, which lets you create your applications using embedded SQL statements, while the precompiler handles all the low-level details of interfacing to the ADO.NET classes. In addition to the exec SQL statements provided with OpenESQL for ODBC, there is an extended form of exec ADO statements that provide direct access to these in-memory database objects like datasets. So how does one use ADO.NET to access a database from within a Visual COBOL program? Well, using ADO.NET in Visual COBOL is a simple three-step process. Install the required ADO.NET provider, create an ADO.NET DSN, create your ADO.NET application. Step 1. Installing the ADO.NET provider. The .NET framework includes support for ADO.NET providers in the system.data namespace. There are some classes that are common to all data providers, and then there are classes supporting specific databases such as SQL Client for SQL Server, Oracle Client for Oracle databases, and ODBC and OLEDB providers for accessing databases through an older technology method. Although you can access Oracle through the Oracle Client provider in the .NET framework, it is recommended that you instead download and install the ODP.NET provider directly from Oracle's website, as it is highly optimized for use with Oracle databases. Likewise, for DB2 access, you should download and install the IBM Data Server for .NET, which provides the IBM.data.db2 set of classes. It is very important that you download and install the correct ADO.NET provider for your system requirements, as there are both 32-bit and 64-bit versions available. You must use the version whose bitism matches the bitism of your compiled application. So if you are compiling a 32-bit application which will be run on a 64-bit version of Windows, you must use the 32-bit version of the ADO.NET provider, but you will get an error when you attempt to connect. For example, the ODP.NET provider is delivered as part of the ODAC or Oracle Data Access components for either x86 or x64 systems, so you must get the correct one for your requirements. When you deploy your application using COBOL Server, you must also ensure that the correct ADO.NET provider is installed on your production system as well, if you are using one of these third-party providers. Now that we have the appropriate ADO.NET provider software installed, it is time to create an ADO.NET data source name that we can use in our connection. This step is only necessary if you will be using Visual COBOL's OpenESQL technology to access ADO.NET through embedded SQL statements in your COBOL source. If you will be interfacing directly to the ADO.NET classes using object-oriented programming, then you will handle database connection through a connection object instead. The tool that is used to create DSNs for ADO.NET is the ADO.NET Connection Editor. Unlike the ODBC Data Source Administration tool, which is provided as part of Windows, the ADO.NET Connection Editor was developed by Micro Focus and is provided as part of the Visual COBOL product itself. The Connection Editor can be started from the Visual COBOL program group under Data Tools, Data Connections, or it can be started from the Tools Micro Focus COBOL menu item of Visual Studio. The editor must be started using administrative permissions in order to add or update connection information, as it stores this information as connection strings within the machine.config file, which is part of the .NET framework of Windows. Let's take a look and see how this connection editor works. Okay, we can find it under All Programs in the Visual COBOL group, under Data Tools, Data Connections, ADO.NET Connection Editor. If we want to create a new one or modify an existing connection, we need to start this with administrative privileges, so we can say Run as Administrator. Okay, here's our editor showing us the connections that we already have under the data source names. Okay. We also have various options for the connection, what type of connection. System is the normal type. What version of the .NET framework you're targeting, where 4.0 is the current framework version we're working with, and whether this will be available for 32-bit or 64-bit. You can see that the list is now showing 32-bit connections. If we click on 64, it only shows the data sources that are available for that bitism. Okay, there's also a list of providers that shows you which providers are currently installed on your system. Here we see some of the standard .NET framework providers, the ODBC and OLEDB, Oracle Client, SQL Client. On this system I also have the IBM data provider installed that I downloaded from IBM. And you can also download the Oracle data provider from Oracle, and it would appear in this list as well. Okay, there are also import and export capabilities in this editor, allowing you to create a connection and then export it to an XML file that can then be imported onto your production system using the connection editor in the COBOL server. To create a new connection, you simply click the Add button, choose the provider for the database that we will be using. Here I have a SQL Server 2008 database on my system, so I'll choose the SQL Client data provider and then give that a data source name that we'll use in the connect statement, and I'll just call it test ADO and click next. Okay, for each of the providers you'll get a different set of connection settings that are completely specific to that connection, to that provider. Here for the SQL Client, for the Microsoft SQL Server, we can see we have various options. We want to set our initial catalog to be the Northwind sample database, so we can put that in there. Data source name, Can either be the machine name of that SQL server, or if you want to access the local SQL server, we can just put local in parentheses. There are various other default options here. Integrated security will set to true. That means it'll use Windows authentication when doing the connect, so we don't have to provide a username and password. Okay, we'll take the defaults for all the others and click on save. Now that appears in the list, and we always want to click on the test connection button to make sure that it's set up properly. If it connects correctly here, chances are good that it will also connect in your program. Now, make note that this is a 32-bit connection, so it will be available to 32-bit applications, .NET managed applications only. If we wanted to create a 64-bit application, we would have to create a 64-bit version of this data source as well. If we now look in the machine.config file, we will be able to see the connection information that we just created. We'll open up that file in Notepad. We can see that it's a standard XML configuration file with various options in it. If we search for the connection name that we just created called test-ADO, we'll find it here under the connection strings heading, along with the other options that appeared in our list of data sources. Okay, these are stored in the format that is used in the connection object to connect to ADO.NET providers. We can see here that our connection string sets the options that we had in our dialog screen, so that when you connect to this name in your program, this is where it'll actually go out and get the information for the connection. Okay, there are other options in here as things like the actual providers definitions. When deploying your application, you must also create a compatible DSN on your production system in order for your application's database connection to be successful. As shown, the ADO.NET connection editor is available in the COBOL server product as well, and an export-import function is available to simplify this process. So we have installed our ADO.NET provider and set up a DSN to point to our database if required. So now all that is left to do is to write our application. There are two methods that you can use to access ADO.NET within a Visual COBOL managed .NET program. The first method is to get down and dirty by coding the calls to the ADO.NET classes directly. This is a viable method to use, and you will find many examples available on the internet of how to do this using C# or VB.NET. This does require object-oriented COBOL programming knowledge, as you must use the invoke and set statements to call available methods and set properties directly within these data objects. If you are more comfortable using traditional COBOL programming methods of embedded SQL statements within your COBOL source programs, then you will probably want to use the second method of accessing ADO.NET from Visual COBOL by using the OpenESQL preprocessor. Embedded SQL allows you to directly code high-level SQL statements surrounded by exec.SQL and end-exec code blocks. These code blocks are compiled by the OpenESQL preprocessor, which generates source containing appropriate calls to the runtime system and underlying ADO.NET classes, and then passes it on to the Visual COBOL compiler for code generation. This allows you to code and debug your programs at the exec.SQL level, which greatly simplifies the task at hand. An extended form of embedded SQL is provided for use with ADO.NET to allow for direct access to the in-memory data objects such as data sets, data tables, and data readers, and allows you to share these objects with other programs. These special statements use exec.ADO blocks instead of exec.SQL, and then the two can be used together to provide very powerful functionality. The Visual COBOL for Visual Studio product also includes the OpenESQL Assistant tool, which provides a graphical environment for designing SQL queries and then automatically generating the required exec-SQL or exec-ADO source code for you. Let's take a look and compare the two methods of accessing ADO.NET within Visual COBOL. Okay, so this is Visual COBOL for Visual Studio 2010. I have 4 projects in my solution to demonstrate the use of ADO.NET within Visual COBOL. The first one is a console application, so it's just a COBOL program. It is not itself a class, but it does access the classes of ADO.NET using object orientation in COBOL. All 4 of these projects do the same basic thing. They connect to a database. They execute a query to select information from the customer's table in the Northwind database, depending on a provided parameter. Okay, let me just run this under the debugger so that we can follow through and see what it's doing. We have various objects, part of the ADO.NET classes. There's a connection object, there's an adapter for reading data from the disk, a data set, which is the memory resident database, and even a row object so that we can go through each row in the result set. Okay, so using OO syntax, we set our connection, we open a connection. Okay, we create a new SQL data adapter. We're saying to use that select statement up above. We're setting the company name to W, so it'll get us all the companies that begin with W or higher. Okay, we create a new data set, and then we fill that data set using the adapter, using the fill method. So now my data set contains the information from the query, and using the perform varying through, we can get each row out of the table that was returned and display it to the console. Should only be a few here. Then we close our connection. If we take a look, we can see that here's the information that it extracted from the table. Okay, so that's using the direct method. For using OpenESQL, we have a similar program here, only it's a lot easier to understand if you're familiar with procedural COBOL programming. Everything's done within exec-SQL blocks. It does exactly the same thing, a lot easier to read. And it's also compatible with how things are done with ODBC as well. You can use the same exec-SQL statements in either ADO or ODBC. Okay, if I run this, okay, we can do automatic error processing. Okay, our connect statement, we're connecting here to the DSN that we created with the connection editor. Declare a cursor for our select, set the parameter, open the cursor, and then just perform through fetching each row and displaying the information. Okay, and then disconnect when done. We can see that here's the information, and it's formatted a little differently, but same information. Okay, one other thing that you can do, if you wanted to use this in a graphical application using WinForms or Windows Presentation Foundation or Web Forms, you can. You can also bind to GUI controls. I'll show a sample of that for each. The first one is using the direct access method, so that when we click a button it will bind the data set to this grid. Okay, if we look at the code for that, we can see it's the same, although now it is in a class because it is a Windows Forms class, and I put all that code within the button click method. So same code. Okay, we run this. Let me run through. We click our button, and now we're in the button click method. So we set our connection, open it, same exact statements we used in the character-based, the console app. Okay, now we have our data set here. What we can do with our data set now that it's filled with the results, we can bind it to this grid control using the data source property and the data member to tell it which table to bind to, which is the customers table. When we execute that, when we return back to display our form, it has bound that data to the grid automatically. Shows up nice formatted in columns with headings. Okay. The same thing can be done with the OpenESQL. We have the same form. We look at the code. Now we have the OpenESQL inside of a class as well, inside of a method. Okay, if we run this, click on Bind Data. Okay, now we can step through our connection. So everything's done the same way as it was in the procedural program. Open the cursor. Now here's our extended statement. So after doing the exec SQL to open the cursor, you can use exec ADO get cursor into my object. And what this does, it will create a data set automatically using the results of that cursor. And we can also tell it that the table within our data set will be called customers. So then we can use the same methods that we used before to bind the results to the data grid. So we can bind that and go back and show that the binding works the same way using OpenESQL. So we have some very powerful options to use here. OpenESQL and the OpenESQL Assistant are covered in more detail in a separate presentation. That brings us to the end of this Visual COBOL in a nutshell presentation of database access using ADO.NET. Thank you for watching and happy programming.